So the DSM, how long has that thing been out there? I'm going to put the dumpster fire right here, but what, 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 when did that thing come out? And then
it was really well intended. Diagnosis, therefore treatment. You should get the diagnosis, and there would be an appropriate treatment associated with the diagnosis. And that theory is great, but it doesn't occur. The diagnosis is categorization. It doesn't predict therapy at all. If it did, there'd be some validity, but even the group that authored it declared that it was not valid. It was highly reliable. You get the same diagnosis if you go through the same process, but it didn't predict how to treat somebody. So it's essentially administrative. It's not an assistance towards therapy at all. And ultimately, if you get a diagnosis, it will follow you around like an albatross. And as a young child, if you get a diagnosis that's a problem, it's going to hang around your neck through school and through the rest of your life. You can end up having an adolescent diagnosis keep you from getting jobs within the government. There's all sorts of difficulties with the categorization. And if a diagnosis doesn't work well to predict a therapy, they'll give you another diagnosis. They tend to multiply like cockroaches. It's an awful circumstance. Ron Swatsina de-identified a few thousand subjects, all of their medical records and their EEG, QEG, and they had 300 and something of them that had been referred in. They found unexpected epileptiform content as one of the highest predictors of medication failure. And, oh, well, that's just for epilepsy, huh? Well, no, 25% of the ADD population, 60% of the autism population, 12% of the anxiety cases, a third of the psychiatric cases that are out there end up having epileptiform content that's unexpected. And if you throw an antipsychotic at somebody who's got an epileptiform discharge, it gets worse. So the badly behaving kid who's actually got a temporal epilepsy driving the rage events is going to get an antipsychotic that's going to make them worse. So the inability to actually look at the pathophysiology instead of some behaviorally linked story that gives you a categorization, you really do need to look at the pathophysiology, not just the story. Goodness knows the adverse childhood experiences now aren't just earlier life trauma. You end up with later life heart conditions and high blood pressures and strokes. And if you have four of the 10 ACEs, you can predict the negative impact on health later in life. So it's important to get down to the pathophysiology, not just the story of trauma.
The individual, and even if it's the story of trauma, which often it isn't, even if people get to the idea, understand that there's trauma involved, which, for instance, with borderline personality disorder, which is probably the most devastating diagnosis to get, and it's most often given to women. And in clinics, it's reported to me that because borderline personality is really an affect regulation, severe affect regulation disorder, right? And you've got down to it. And the most expensive disorder in the mental health system. It's the most stigmatized. And in clinics, they will put on the top of a file in red letters, they'll put borderline. Now, what does that do to the treatment of this individual for this treatment? Nothing good. People avoid these patients if they can. There is literature suggesting that a high percentage of people given that diagnosis also have epileptiform activity. 50 hertz bursts of 50 hertz, right? So paroxysmal activity at the very least, and that they are trying to manage these brains, and there's nothing, with the possible exception of anti-epileptics, that are going to address this. And those are given. They're called mood stabilizers when they're given by psychiatrists. They're called anti-seizure medication when they're given by neurologists. When neurologists characterize somebody who psychiatrists or psychologists look at as borderline, they call them temporal lobe personalities. They have a sense that the temporal lobe, or they have the awareness that the temporal lobes are dysregulated. And there isn't anything that we're doing, including talk therapy, play therapy, any of the standard therapies that can address a brain that's erupting. What we're doing is stigmatizing people with these diagnoses, and it stigmatizes them in all realms of their life, but even in their treatment. It's a catastrophe.